This week's video is going to be a bit different. Think of it as more of a little life update, together with discussing my recent online shop, the pros and cons of selling work like this versus, say, attending fairs or selling through galleries, together with some information about how I actually pack pots. Last Sunday, on the 17th of August, my online shop went live, and despite my fears about things not selling out as quickly as they normally do, as I'm not currently shipping to the EU or the US, it still somehow sold out just as quickly. In fact, all of it went in about 3 minutes, 53 seconds, which is a record, I think. So thank you to everyone who took part, and whether you managed to get something or not, your support means just as much, regardless. For a really long time, the US has been the largest demographic that buys my work, so to be totally honest, without it, I was feeling really worried. I guess I was still confident that things would sell, but the last couple of months, and years really, have felt really difficult. Shipping abroad is just becoming more and more difficult. First with the fiasco that was Brexit, then the GPSR health and safety regulations for shipping to Europe, which has essentially just introduced a ton of red tape and paperwork, and the hiring of an EU representative, which is something I have to do in order to sell back into that market. And now, more recently, of course, there are the tariffs, together with an executive order that was put out on the 30th of July, which abolished the de minimis exemption to the US. Essentially, this meant that any parcel going into the United States that was worth less than $800 could do so tax-free, meaning you, the client, wouldn't have to pay anything in order to get the parcel into the country. The issue that arose this shop update is whilst I could quite easily collect the 10% tariff from my American customers, I would then have to prepay these duties when I ship the parcels. As currently, and from the 29th of August, the Customs and Border Protection Agency in the United States wouldn't accept any parcels into the country if the duties weren't already paid. As this was all developing so quickly, the couriers in the UK haven't yet set up the systems in place that allow me to pay this tax preemptively, which means that all your orders, even if you paid the 10% tariffs, if I sent them to the United States, they would all just be rejected to me and I'd have to pay for the shipping back. Then I'd probably have to have about 100 individual conversations with you guys about rearranging delivery and requesting more funds for shipping. And all the parcels may still just get stuck in customs, as there are going to be huge delays as the entire planet rushes to get their orders into the United States before that deadline. I hope that sort of explains the situation as to why I didn't ship to the United States this time. In the lead up to this restock, I was immensely stressed, and I spent practically an entire day on the phone trying to get answers from companies, but nobody could tell me anything. So in a way, the least stressful thing for me to do was just to cut that delivery option. The funny thing is that didn't stop tons of you from the United States simply placing collection orders, as if they were checking out from the UK. Some of you have already collected your pots, and with a few others I'll be hanging onto them until July, next year when they visit for a holiday. Or I'm shipping them to friends of theirs in the UK or abroad, whereupon they can arrange delivery between themselves. Now, before we get on to other topics, I want to quickly run you through how I pack the pots themselves in this very short video I made for Instagram a few days ago. There are tons of ways to wrap and ship pots safely. There are also lots of different material types you can use. I tend to begin with some simple tissue paper, which just softens the edges a touch. Then, for bowls, where the rim is generally the most vulnerable part, I place a square of cardboard just under the rim, and then I wrap this assemblage in a sheet of this paper bubble wrap. This paper doesn't have any pockets of air inside it, but rather these dimples, which when folded and wrapped over each other, create this very rigid structure. And by wrapping from corner to corner like this, I only need to use one piece of tape to pin it all together. I then wrap this in a layer of corrugated cardboard, which creates a much harder outer shell around the object. Essentially, through this wrapping, if you poke at the pot inside it, you shouldn't be able to feel any edges of the pot wrapped inside. The next thing is perhaps the most important, and that's the quality of the boxes you're using. I use the sorts that are double-walled. They are more expensive, but the difference in how strong they are once fully wrapped up is immense. And I can actually stand on one of these boxes with my full weight if it is properly wrapped up, so don't skimp out if you can on the boxes themselves. The next really important thing to consider is the pot's position in the box itself. You don't want to place it directly next to one of the internal walls, as if the box is banged from the outside during transit and the pot is directly next to it, there's a far greater chance it will break. So instead you want to completely encase the pot in some kind of loose fill. I use this biodegradable puffed starch, which I place below, around, and on top, making sure there's space around the entire vessel where these can fill. You also don't want to be meagre with these. The box itself should feel really difficult to close. Obviously not impossible, but you want the contents to sort of feel as if they're going to burst out. Yet of course, it's taped securely enough to hold everything inside. In terms of the tape I used to actually close the box, I've been using this water-activated tape, as not only is it much cheaper in the long run, but it also bonds to the cardboard and creates a very strong join, meaning there's practically no chance of it coming loose and pinging off during transit. Often to close the boxes, I press them against the workbench like this, as it helps to keep the closed flaps properly flat. Ideally, you want everything that's wrapped up inside to stay exactly where put, and if you close the box and you can feel everything inside just rattling around, then unfortunately you've definitely packed it too loosely. So I do give my pots a shake to check, and this is essentially repeated hundreds of times for all the pots sold in my last shop restock, all 305 of them. Thankfully, many people do tend to snag a handful of pieces. This means I can pack them together, meaning I have to ship fewer boxes. Yet, this raises one of the key issues at the moment. I call my online shop a lottery, as there are generally about 25,000 people on the website the moment it goes live. This means that each piece on the shop is likely in about 50 or 60 people's baskets. All of these people are then simultaneously checking out, and thus the system has to pick somebody to win. That's why I call it a lottery. The truth is that most websites aren't really built for this amount of traffic, and I understand completely how frustrating it must feel to have something in your basket only for it to be purchased quickly by somebody else, as there is no grace period option with Squarespace. Fundamentally, my shop is completely first come, first serve. But this also means that there's been people who've been attempting to buy something for years. Having a grace period could help, where say the items that you add to your basket are saved for about 5 minutes. But equally, I've heard from other makers who do sell work like this that there are plenty of other issues that arise with that system. For instance, one person can essentially add dozens of items to their basket, essentially preventing the shop from working for anybody else. Now times that by about 1,000, 2,000 or 25,000 people, and you run into a real issue where items are constantly being saved, then they come off being saved as people make their decisions on what they want to buy, which means all the other people on the website having to refresh and check stock constantly. The other issue, and this happened to a friend of mine who had a grace period that was infinite, is that one person just added everything to their basket using a bot, which then meant thousands of other people just couldn't use the shop at the moment the drop went live. All of this makes me a bit cautious about grace periods, and it's also not an option Squarespace currently offers, meaning I couldn't try it even if I wanted to. The other suggestion many people had is to sell more of my work through galleries, or by doing pre-orders, so I'll speak about both of these options next. Selling work with galleries is complex. I think fundamentally they can be really beautiful, standalone moments that help to celebrate makers in a physical space where people can come to see the work in person and to hold and touch it. For this reason alone, I really like being involved in a few exhibitions every year. But the thing is, with the advent of social media, the way you sell work has changed. It used to be, as a maker, you often had to rely on a shop or a gallery in order to sell your work. Yet of course, those galleries typically take 50%. That's normal. Or they work on a sale or return basis, where they take the work for no cost and only pay you if they sell something. And this can be a huge risk for the maker depending on how active the gallery is in promoting and selling your work. Nowadays, makers have a lot more agency. We have a lot more control as we can build our own audiences online and sell the work directly to them, which also means we can keep 50% more money, which is honestly really amazing, as historically potters and makers and craftspeople tend not to earn that much. So if you can exist without relying on galleries and losing 50% of your income, that's huge. Anyway, the idea that if I gave more work to galleries and sold through them, you would have an easier time buying it doesn't really work, I think. As of course, it's going to be within my best interest for the work to sell, so it goes without saying that of course I'm going to advertise the fact I'm selling work there. And this means my audience just bombards the gallery and purchases the work immediately anyway. Not only that, but I'm potentially losing half of the income, or you're having to purchase it at twice the rate if I do want to keep the original amount. There are also multiple other factors. One strange one for me is that with a following of millions, if I direct my audience to a gallery, I'm essentially advertising them for free, and with a really specialised demographic of people who buy art and craft. So if 5,000 people go to somebody's website to look at my work, they may end up looking at other pieces too. Other work that the gallery is selling. So in one way, by exhibiting my work, they're also gaining huge free advertising to precisely the audience they want. So in that case, is 50% still fair? And should I potentially negotiate a better rate to account for that? Also, over the years, I've seen many potters and makers produce content that advertises their work much better than anything the galleries they're working with actually do themselves. In fact, some galleries can be quite lazy, and I've seen this in person when I was working with Lisa Hammond. We visited a gallery in the countryside that was stocking some of her work, and a few months later when we visited, it was still unboxed in the back. gathering dust. We also saw work that was put on a dingy, shadowy shelf that as a customer you could barely see when browsing inside the shop. All of this is to say that really, I think as makers you should be very careful about who you choose to sell with. But of course it is also worth remembering that selling with certain galleries exposes your work to clientele you could have never dreamed of finding otherwise. So in some cases it really is worth doing, just for that. But for you obtaining my work more easily, I don't think it really solves the issue. Now, the next option is pre-orders. I quite like the theory of this, that you can place an order on the website and then a few months later a mug arrives at your door. But in reality, I don't think there would really be any difference compared to how I usually sell my work. As in my usual restocks, I have all the one-off pieces, which there are only one item of, and then I have things like mugs and bowls and store jars and teapots, which there can be many multiples of. For instance, in my last shop restock, there were 30 of each mug in each colour. Now, if I was doing pre-orders, I'd still have to set limits as to how many of each vessel I would want to sell, and they would very likely be similar to the quantities I'm selling at the moment. This means the pre-orders would likely sell out just as quickly due to these limitations. As if I didn't have them in place and say people could order 1,000 of each piece, then I'd have to spend the next couple of years and months working down these long lists of pots I have to make and fire. The irritating thing is that if I did this, I could potentially make millions of pounds, but I just don't want to be stuck in that rat race of producing the same work over and over again for years. That's really not why I got into this craft, and at the moment I'm very lucky as I can essentially make and do what I want and sell it. If I were to sell thousands of pots, then I would likely have to hire staff, find a bigger space, buy more kilns, and really scale up my business in order to meet demand. But I've never been somebody who wants to run a business like that. Truth be told, I like working by myself and making small batches of work. I like listening to my audiobooks, going for dog walks, and not existing in this pressurized environment where I'm delegating tasks and running a much bigger team. And I think many of you would actually agree with that, as if you bought a pot from me, I think you would like to know that it was actually made by my hands. I've tried to build this very personal world online, and I think in many ways that is why it's ultimately connected with so many people. I hope to think that you think that I'm very definitely not a brand, but a person, and I think scaling up can affect that quite dangerously. By the way, that's not to say I won't ever hire help. In fact, I did for this packing session for the first time ever, and I can't tell you the difference it made, so I'll definitely do it again in the future. I guess the thing is, with an audience in the millions, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to satisfy demand. And I think many people, when they first try and use my shop, don't really understand quite just how much demand there is. Hence the wonderful emails I receive like this, after my shop goes live. This leaves me with sort of three options. The first, and perhaps the most obvious when it comes to dealing with supply and demand, is to simply increase the prices dramatically. If everything at the moment, even with cutting my US and EU audiences, sells out in 3.5 minutes, then in theory I could triple or even quadruple the prices of everything, have the work sell out much more slowly, and make far more money, and thus obtaining the goal of having my own studio, which I actually own, much faster. The obvious problem with this is it makes my work really unobtainable for most people, which isn't something I particularly like. My pots are already relatively expensive, but the pots such as mugs, tumblers and the small bowls are within many people's price ranges, even if they have to save. But if they were 2 or 3 or 4 times the price, then my work only really becomes obtainable by people with very disposable incomes. The other thing I could keep doing is making and selling these smaller pots for these lesser prices, but then increase the prices of my larger, one-off objects. The issue is that many of my mugs already get resold for much more, often for hundreds and hundreds of pounds or dollars. Thus, if I were to just keep selling these cheaper for what they typically sell on the secondary market, is that a good financial idea or a bad one? Pricing itself is a really complicated topic, especially when it sort of enters this realm where it becomes collectible, is highly in demand, and is already selling on the secondary market. But if I were to considerably raise my prices, the work would sell out more slowly, and people would be able to browse and make more careful selections. The second option is to introduce a proper lottery or auction system. Lots of these options are really interesting, such as one where you have to purchase, say, raffle tickets, which then enters you into a lottery, and from this a much smaller group of people are selected that actually gain access to the shop. You can also have interesting systems where the tickets themselves cost anywhere between £10 to £20, and I sell, say, 10,000 tickets. That's anywhere between £100,000 and £200,000. And then when people actually get into the shop, the prices of the pots themselves are really cheap, but I make more of my money from ticket sales, if that makes sense. There are countless other auction or lottery-based systems that could work, but again, the issue from my end is that all of these options create more back-end work, and that's more time that I have to spend on the computer organising things, when what I really want to be doing is actually making pottery. I know this is potentially a really silly thing to say, and it might come across as being selfish, but now, more than ever, with all the other projects I do in social media content creation, I need to protect my actual time spent making. And for that reason, I'm sort of wary about any system that means I have to spend more time on the computer. I also know that hiring people to help me is an option, for people to create these websites, manage these auctions, and so on. But again, that just comes with more delegating, and whilst it may create a fairer system of obtaining work, it also inevitably adds complication. There's another method I've seen for selling work, and that's simply to set up a subscription service. This could be on Instagram or YouTube, for instance, whereupon I charge about £5 per month, and if you're on that list, you're given the password to the shop early. But again, what's to stop, say, 10,000 people subscribing to this model and all shopping at the same time like people normally do, meaning that it would still be pretty chaotic. To fix this, the subscription could be much higher, with my expectation being that the shop wouldn't sell out to those people on this sort of VIP list. Then, say, after 30 minutes, I would open it up to the general public. Anyway, these are just a few ideas, and there are so many more, such as auctioning off each individual piece, but with 305 pots, that would just take such a long time. Anyway, before I get onto the third option, do let me know if you have any ideas or solutions, ways of making it fairer, more simple, definitely not more complicated. This topic always generates quite interesting conversations, so I look forward to reading all of your comments. The third and final option is just to keep going like I normally do, to keep the shop first come, first serve, awarding those people who can click the fastest or live closest to wherever the Squarespace data center is. I think one thing I want to do in the coming years to make the shopping experience better is to hire somebody to create a sort of digital catalogue which is made public before the shop actually goes live. This way people can have a proper look at the pots they're buying, rather than just clicking blindly and praying you make it through the checkout process without somebody beating you. With this method, the supply will always be low, but I think that's always going to be the case considering the size of the audience I have. Truth be told, I'm still learning an awful lot as I go, and I still find all this attention completely baffling and surreal, as I never in a million years suspected there to be this sort of demand for my work. In reality, I'm still a very small business, and I still tackle things as they come, and I learn a tremendous amount as I go. But most importantly, I guess I want to thank all of you, as even if you didn't snag a piece of pottery, your likes, comments, follows and shares has all led to me being able to pursue a career as a potter without there being nearly as much trouble as I thought there initially might be when I first set out on this journey some 15 years ago. And I'm really just very lucky to have such a kind, committed audience here online, and I owe you all so much. Anyway, this pile is what's heading to the UK. I wish I had counted, but I guess I'll do that in the next step. These boxes are going to Switzerland, Norway, Japan and Singapore. And then here are all the parcels heading to Australia and Canada. And then there are all the parcels destined for collection. And I'm really looking forward to meeting so many of you over the coming months. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch and for listening to this ramble. I hope you found some of the topics interesting. And I'll be returning to more regular programming next week.